Now, let's jump into the lesson. So, can everybody see my screen? It should say today's objectives. Can you all see that? Awesome. Thank you for the thumbs up, everyone. Okay. Oh, all right. So the first thing that I want to talk about here is we're talking about the concepts of security. So this is going to be, think of it as a 101 class, right? So the 101 class is where we're going to talk very bare minimum basics. Okay. So if this is completely foreign to you, that's completely okay. If you're someone who already has cybersecurity knowledge or even IT knowledge, I challenge you to see what are some new things you can extrapolate from this. What's something that you didn't know before that you just learned today? Because that's what I'll ask at the end of the class. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the fundamentals of cybersecurity. We're going to talk about the different types of cybersecurity because there's something called crisis management, which I'll explain later, which involves physical security. That is a part of security overall. We'll talk about something called zero trust. I'll help define what exactly zero trust is and how exactly it works. And then we'll talk about a gap analysis. I'll show you a kind of gap analysis, like an example template that you can use, followed by different threats. Now, these threats are going to be very bare minimum. They're going to be the basic threats that you will run into, or the most common ones. And then we'll also talk about one of the key principles about cybersecurity, which is the CIA Triad. Now, when it comes to the things that you should memorize, the CIA Triad is definitely one, not only because it is the cornerstone of cybersecurity, but also because it is one of the interview questions you will be asked. Someone will say, can you explain the A in the CIA Triad? Or someone will say, can you explain what the CIA Triad is? So it's important for you to understand that. The other thing you need to know is the AAA model. I'll tell you right now, that stands for authentication, authorization, and accounting. This is in regards to what we call IAM, Identity Access Management. Now, I'm throwing a lot of acronyms at you. It's completely okay. Just write them down and then you can go look at them later. The way that I find is easiest to study when it comes to this is to write the terms down that you hear that you're like, oh, that sounds like something I should know. Or when I say you should know this, write it down, look it up later, and then after class, go ahead and review it on your own. Or you can go back and look at the recordings. But these are the things we're going to go through today. This is one of my favorite classes to teach because it really touches on the fundamental pieces of cybersecurity. So when we're going through this, please go ahead and ask your questions. Okay, let me check the chat. All right, we're good. A lot of thumbs up. Love to see it. Love to see it. All right. So let's start with the basics. So in your own words, without typing anything yet, explain in your own words what you think cybersecurity is. Now, please respond to the chat that I just put in there. Okay? And in the thread, respond in the thread. That's the key. In your own words, and you don't have to use technical terms, just use any term that you know, okay? Explain in your own words what cybersecurity is. I see responses coming in. Okay, protection of people. All right. Right. We have a couple of things come in. Love these answers. Protection of people. Cybersecurity is securing our laptop from hackers. Securing information. Protecting computers, phones, networks, data from harmful attacks. It's often called IT security or information security. Love to see that. We have data protection, guarding data, protecting infrastructure, safeguarding digital. Love all these answers. Mabushar with the copy and paste. Well done. If it's not copy and paste, I'm very impressed that you were able to type that much that quickly. Everyone remember, we're trying to answer on the thread, okay? Keep that in mind. Okay, Love all of these answers. Now, here is how I like to describe cybersecurity. I love all these answers, but the way I like to describe it is cybersecurity is the art of protecting people, places, and things. Now, that's a very rudimentary and I would say simple way of explaining cybersecurity, but I like to use it that way because it's an easy way to explain it to a teenager or to your parent. So people are going to ask you, what is cybersecurity? How does that work? The first thing they're going to tell you is, oh, does that mean you have to code? You have to know coding? You have to bring up this black screen with green text to make it do stuff? Sure. That's a piece of it. And sure, you could say coding is needed in cybersecurity, but more often than not, it's not as important. Okay. I know so many people in the cybersecurity industry who don't know any code, including myself. Now, do I know the basic scripts in order to hack into a network? Yeah, with some help, I can. However, the majority of cybersecurity professionals are not coders. What we do is focused on protecting people. That's why it comes first. Places, which means physically protecting buildings, physically protecting servers, physically protecting places where we have very important information and things. The biggest thing here is when I say things, it can be a lot of things. It can be physical documents. It can be data centers. It can be assets. It can be software. It's very, very vast. Now, I like using this term because anytime you explain cybersecurity to someone, you should make it in a way that they can understand. The key element here is protecting. That's your entire goal, is you're supposed to protect your information. You're supposed to protect your data. Now, cybersecurity has a very rich history. We'll start with a little bit of background. So, cybersecurity is really important to the government nowadays. As you'll see, the FBI and a lot of security focused government entities are really invested in what they call national security. National security now means cyber warfare. You may not know it, but there's huge cyber warfare happening all the time, almost every day between nation states. Nation states are different countries that have a vested interest in toppling each other and controlling information. That's why it's called intel. Now, something to understand is that cybersecurity is all about information and power. So the cybersecurity industry has been ramping up more and more the industry has found ways to cripple the networks and systems. Here's an example. So there is something called the Robert Morris worm. Now here, this person, their name is Robert Tappan Morris. Now, this is back in 1988, in case you couldn't tell by the glasses and whatnot. But in essence, what Robert did here was he created a harmless test. He thought that he would just create a little harmless test that just wanted to test out, see what happens. So what he did is he created what we call a worm. That's why they call it the Morse worm. Now, a worm is a type of malware that replicates itself, okay? That means that it spreads across the networks without needing to happen. If it just reaches a server, well, then it's able to replicate itself and set itself to another person, okay? Now, it doesn't need to attach to another program or anything, but in essence, it's just a replication capability worm. Okay. Now, what happened was he was at Cornell and he was a computer science graduate student. So what he did was he hacked into MIT computer, he created this one worm, and then he essentially sent it out all over. When he sent it out all over, it infected about 10% of the internet. Now you have to understand, that's a huge portion. There's about 60,000 to about 60,000 computers, 6,000 to about 60,000 computers. Okay. So because of this, even though it was a harmless mistake, well then it it impacted a lot of computers uncontrollably, meaning that it was not able to be stopped until some people took some very, very specific steps. Now, what are the impact? Well, it slowed down some military systems, slowed down some academic systems. It essentially was a case study on, it was essentially a case study on how sending malware can really, really slow down a lot of systems. Why is this important? Well, it essentially highlights how two things. One, how easy it is to send malware and to stop systems from working. And two, it highlights how non-malicious code, even if done accidentally, can cause real-world harm. A figure to understand here is that about 80% of all incidents that happen all over the world are associated with humans, meaning humans either make a mistake or they do an action that causes an incident to happen. An incident is anytime there's a data leak, a system goes down, or it impacts the CIA Triad, which we'll talk about a little later. Okay? So when I mentioned the worm, right? The worm is, yes, it's like this little worm. However, it stands for write once, read many. So you write the code once, you send it out, and it can replicate itself. Now, quiz time. And remember, answer in the thread. Quiz answer. So in this quiz, the question is, what was the primary intention behind the creation of the Morris worm in 1988? A, B, C, or D? Answer in the thread. I see Hema answered, a lot more people jumping in. Oybeck, good to see you again, good sir. Glad we're working together again. Thank you for answering that question. Andre, I see your question here. Um, Thank you for answering, Nora. All right. Thank you so much, everyone who's answering in the thread. I see a lot of questions. I see a lot of C's and B's. Okay. All right. Let's go with B. I see a lot of those. So I didn't mention this specifically, but here, if we go to the very top here, we say that he wrote one just to see if it's possible, and he released worm disguise to disguise his identity. Yeah, he was just, in essence, it was harmless. He was not trying to steal sensitive information. He was not trying to show what a new virus can do, and he wasn't trying to maliciously impact global communications or networks. All he was doing was trying to gauge the size of the interconnected internet. So what I mean by this is he wasn't trying to cause harm. He wasn't trying to cause issues. So we talked about the Morris worm and how it was non-malicious, but it impacted a lot of systems, right? So here is the second question. And those of you who answered, we're going to do a second quiz here. Now, you don't know this, but you can look this up. Go ahead and go to Google and look this up. But here is the second quiz thread. So with the Morris worm, Robert became the first person convicted under A, B, C, or D. I see people already posting in the thread. We're getting really good at that. Love seeing it. Good job, everyone. In case you don't know, the thread is pinned. It is the last comment that was pinned. All right. I see people commenting. We got some C's and B's. See. Give you all a bit more, a couple more seconds here. The answers are quite The answers are quite broad. So I see a lot of people answering with C, B, okay. I see a couple D's in there. So the answer in this case is actually D. Now, you may not have known this. It's completely okay. That's the entire point here. We're not trying to like trick you in some way, but the idea here is just to get more familiar and practicing Googling, okay? In case you're not familiar, there is a new tool I want to present to you all. It is called Perplexity. So Perplexity is essentially Google on steroids. If I were to just copy and paste this into Perplexity, I'll say, hey, under what? It's essentially Google, however, it gives me citations. So the cool thing about this is just like ChatGPT, we're able to get the answers we want, but we can get it in the format that we want. I like this because yes, you can look it up on Google, but you might have to jump through a couple links. Instead, this gives you the answer straight up, and then you can pick the source from wherever here. Okay, for example, if I were to click this, then it shows Robert Morris, and then it gives all the information about him. So I like this. I like this tool a lot because it makes searching a lot easier. I will say this also, this is the future. Perplexity is one of the Perplexity and AI are going to be widespread moving forward. So Robert Morris was convicted under CFAA. That's not something you need to memorize, but it's just good information to know. Okay. That being said, right? When we're talking about cybersecurity today, I want to kind of give you some key definitions. I said that cybersecurity is a concept of protecting people, places, and things. That's completely accurate, but if we want to become even more specific, Webster says that it's measures taken to protect a computer or computer system on the internet against unauthorized access or attack. In simple terms, it's protecting systems and networks. What are you protecting them from? You're protecting them from theft, not letting people access information that they shouldn't have access to, from damage, meaning that they don't get I would say corrupted. And then last one is that they don't get altered. What I mean by altering is when you have data, you want to keep its integrity. That's something that we'll talk about in the CIA Triad, because its integrity means that it hasn't been tampered with and people haven't changed any information inside of the servers that you have. All right. Well, what are you protecting them from? Well, one of the key things you want to protect them from is something called a threat actor. So a threat actor is a person, a group, or a system. We have to include the term system now because AI is growing and computer systems are becoming smarter to the point where we're able to automate certain hacks and certain threats. But a threat actor is a person, group, or system with the capability and intent. So they have an intent to cause harm to a computer system. Harm can look like damaging the system, making sure the system isn't available, or stealing something from the system. The entire goal here is nefarious and with a negative intent. These are what we call threat actors. And we'll talk a bit more about the definitions of these down the line. Now, another definition for cybersecurity is cybersecurity is the activity or process, ability, capability whereby information communication systems contained therein are protected from and are defended against damage, unauthorized use or modification. Again, this is about integrity or exploitation. This is a mouthful. The reason why I like to say it's the process of protecting people, places, and things is because it incorporates all of this in an easy to understand statement. Now, it is important to understand the technical definition of cybersecurity because it is very computer oriented. It is very internet and network oriented, which is why a lot of cybersecurity is centered around, at least at the fundamental level, understanding networking. Networking and network devices and how network and data process through a network is important so that you can understand, you know how to defend it. A key element in cybersecurity is knowing what you know, because if you don't know what you don't know how to protect it. You'll hear me say this time and time again, that in order to protect your data and your systems, you have to know what exists within your system. That means understanding the network, understanding the devices that exist on the network, understanding what type of data you store on the network, understanding how that data is processed, stored, and how important that data is. This is something called PII. So PII stands for personally identifiable information. You don't have to memorize that just yet, but you will hear it more often in the class. In essence, PII data and just data in general is the treasure trove that cybersecurity has. So that's what you're trying to protect. Okay? Let's go ahead and move on to, as we go to the next slide here, remember that our goal is to protect the systems, the computers, and the networks. So what are we trying to protect them from? Well, there are a bunch of different threats that exist inside the cybersecurity landscape. Now, when we're talking about cybersecurity, we're talking about an entire network. We're talking about data. We're talking about servers. Think of it essentially as your home, right? So your home, you have very specific information that should only be known to you. Your credit card information, your full name, your birthday. Maybe you have treasured information such as a very special diary that you don't want anyone to have. Maybe it's your kid's photo album. All of those are things that you want to protect, right? Now, keep that in mind as we talk about these, okay? Because these are some of the threats that exist today that that could impact you. So the first thing is a virus. Okay, so a virus is a type of malware. As a reminder, a malware, in essence, it's like a malicious software. So mal in French, right? That means mal. Mal means bad. So malware is just bad software. It's essentially designed to damage, disrupt, or gain unauthorized access to a system. And there are viruses that exist everywhere. So a virus is essentially malware that replicates itself by modifying different programs on its code. Now, it's intended to harm the system and maybe corrupt files, delete information, or just make it so that it's unusable. Now, there are going to be a lot of different viruses out there. A lot of these are going to seem similar. Something else that exists out there is what we call worm. We already explained that a worm is a self-replicating malware that spreads over a network. The thing with a worm is it does not need human interaction in order for it to replicate itself, okay? Now, how does a worm spread? Well, they spread through what we call vulnerabilities. A vulnerability is a weakness that exists within a system. We'll learn a lot more about that down the line. Like I said, if these are new terms to you that you're saying, oh, these are confusing, these are a lot, it's okay. This is new information. You're stretching a muscle that you've never used before. We're going to coach you through this. So just keep that in mind and track along as we go through this. Then we have what we call Trojan. So if you know anything about the Trojan horse in regards to like the Troy incident, there was a movie with Brad Pitt and Eric Bana back in the day. It's called Troy. In it, I'll spoiler alert, they create a wooden horse. It's a Trojan horse, and they put bad actors inside of it, and then that's how they took the city down. A Trojan horse is exactly that. It is a program that parades itself as an authentic and actual software, a legitimate software that can be used for a specific purpose, but it's actually deceptive. Its main purpose is to cause disruption. It's to create what we call a backdoor. You'll hear that sometimes in cybersecurity. It's creating a backdoor so that a threat actor can maintain access to a system or disrupt a system overall. Then we have spyware, which essentially can spy on your computer or spy on what you're looking at or look on your internet. We have ransomware. Ransomware, in short, is a software that encrypts your entire computer so that you can't do anything. And then the hacker is going to ask for payment to make sure so that you can get your files back. This can be something as simple as your work computer, so you don't have access to certain programs anymore, or it can be your personal computer. In essence, one rule: never pay the ransom. The reason why is if you were to pay the ransom, there is no guarantee that you would get your programs back and you lose a lot of money. What you should do is you should reach out to either your work IT department or security department, or you should reach out to your computer manufacturer if it's a personal one, and you should reach out to the authorities. Right now, police and law enforcement are being trained on how to respond to ransomware or cybersecurity threats because they are on the rise. I've trained some police departments myself on how to respond on these, and they are becoming better and better at it. Okay. Now, this is an important one. Phishing. So phishing, not like actually fishing for fish, right? Phishing is the concept of sending a fake email that is intended to trick a user into clicking it so that it can download malware onto their computer. Phishing is one of the most common types of cyber attacks today. So the three most common ones are phishing, ransomware, and social engineering. Now, social engineering is pretty broad because phishing falls under social engineering, but social engineering is essentially called human hacking. It's having humans make a mistake or do something that is malicious with them maybe not having that negative intent. I'll explain some stories about that later. But when you look at phishing emails, these tend to be emails that have misspellings, maybe it's not the correct grammar, and there typically is a sense of urgency. It's saying, hey, you have to update your password right now. Hey, we noticed some bad activity on your computer. You have to fix it right now. These are typically good signs of phishing emails. And then we have rootkits. These are essentially pre-built software. They allow you to have unauthorized access and they exist within malware. Typically rootkits, they're going to be secondary. So there'll be an attack, but then another attack um, will essentially be like rootkits that allow backwards access. Adware, you see this all the time. If you've ever, which you shouldn't do, if you've ever gone to a website to quote unquote pirate a movie, you'll see a bunch of ads everywhere that say, hey, this is the download button. This is the download button. This is an example of adware. So essentially it's like unwanted ads that are trying to get you to click something. However, this is extended in the sense that in your web browser, if you download adware, it'll show you even more ads that you don't want to see. A man in the middle attack, this is when a threat actor gets in between you and your intended source. Now, basic networking. You have a computer here and another computer here. Let's say that I'm in the process of trying to send an email or a file to Keith Edwards. So if I have my computer here, I'm trying to send a file to Keith Edwards, and let's say just for just for argument's sake, that Zainab is a threat actor. And Zainab can go ahead and go in between our connection and read the file that I'm trying to send. Even better, let's say I want to send Keith a bunch of money, right? If I want to do that, well, then I'll say, hey, here's my account number. I'll send it to I'll send all this money to this account number. Is that accurate? Okay. Well, Zainab can change that information, send it over to Keith, and then say, hey, actually, can you send me money first and send it to this account, right? And change that information. A man in the middle attack is just intercepting communication between two parties to steal data, adjust data, or alter information. This is one of the most common attacks you'll see out there as well. It's called a DDoS attack. This stands for distributed denial of service. So distributed denial of service, think of it as a flooding a system with information. Now, the more technical term is you can send a bunch of traffic to a certain server or certain computer to render it inoperable, meaning it can't work anymore. So that's what a DDoS attack is. More often than not, because this is one of the easiest attacks to do, they will do a DDoS attack and then combine it with a Trojan or a phishing attack, so that it'll come off multiple fronts. So I used to work as a what we call incident response. So incident response means that if we notice that there is an active hack on our system, I am the person who organizes and orchestrates what people do in the instance of an incident. Now, in this case, the reason why when we know that someone is attempting to hack us, we do not put all of our resources on that one location. We instead divide the team up and say, hey, you guys check on this, and you guys go check our backend systems. Can you guys go and check all of our data centers? And then can you guys make sure you go and check the physical security? The reason why is because if it's a smart hacker, well, then they're going to attack you not on just one front, but multiple fronts, because they know that the security team is going to be busy trying to just focus on one. So a good cybersecurity team does not just focus all their efforts on that one hack that's happening. And then last and not least, there's something called a zero-day exploit. Now, in very simple terms, a zero-day exploit just means that there's a vulnerability that exists in your company, but you don't know it yet, okay? That's all that means. And we'll talk a bit more about this later on. All right, now let's go ahead and answer these 3 quiz questions. Again, on the threads, quiz question 1. So quiz question 1, A, B, C, or D. Which threat type involves malware that encrypts user data and demands payment? Please reply in the thread. Love to see it, love to see it. Awesome, everyone is correct. The answer is ransomware. See, you all are already getting very familiar with the different cybersecurity terms. So yes, you are accurate. Malware that encrypts user data and demands payment is called ransomware. Good job, everyone. Thank you to all of you who responded in the thread. Don't forget, the thread is the best way to answer so that we don't flood the text, okay? So appreciate everyone doing that. And in case you don't know, Zainab is always pinning the comment where you need to put that in. All right. Quiz question 2. Question is, what type of threat secretly collects user data through their internet connection without their consent, often for advertising purposes, resembling superfish adware incident? Okay. Let's see the answers. So we got a lot of people saying A, got some people saying B. Okay. We're kind of in the middle here. I see a lot of people picking adware, and I would see why you would say that, because it says that here, right? But the element to keep in mind here is collects user data through the internet without their consent. So without their consent is the key element here. So that would be spyware, okay? And then last one, question 3, or quiz 3, I should say. Which threat involves malicious programs disguised as legitimate software, often creating backdoors for malicious access? Good job commenting on the thread, everyone. All right, looks like we got that answer. It is B. It is Trojans. A real example here is something called the Emotet Trojan. So back in 2024, there was a Trojan called an Emotet, all right? Or the Trojan called Emotet. It was actually trying to parade itself like legitimate software. But when someone downloaded it and executed / clicked on it, well, then it gave threat actors access to their backend systems, okay? So Emotet is an example of a real world Trojan. Let's carry on here. All right. So how is cybersecurity an essential function in everyday life? Well, in essence, when we're talking about cybersecurity, right, there are a couple things to keep in mind. Like we said, we're trying to protect people, places, and things. Well, What are those things and why? The entire question here is the why. For one, we want to protect assets. Now, if you're a company, you have very specific data that you want to keep confidential. Maybe it is code, your code that you have for your own company. Maybe it's intellectual property. So maybe it's like new new uh new schematics or new designs for a new car that you're building. Maybe it's something like personal data, like maybe it's your personal data or client personal data or credit card information. All of these are what we call assets that we're trying to protect. An asset is any sort of type of data, information, or physical thing that you don't want outside individuals to know, or outside parties to know. So you have to make sure you protect those assets on all levels. We'll kind of talk about what those levels are later. Another thing that's really important about cybersecurity is you're not only trying to protect assets, but you're also trying to protect the company's reputation. A company's reputation is incredibly important today. A very common example, even though it's not cybersecurity related, look at what's happening to Tesla. So Tesla, because their CEO is in deep waters and they've had negative interactions or negative press, has caused their reputation to go really, really down. So now Tesla's stock is at an abysmal level. So the reputation of a company is incredibly important because you're trying to protect shareholder values and stakeholder values because you have investors if you're a public company. You also want to protect your reputation because just like LastPass, which is a password management tool, they've been hacked several times. So now, even though they're still a good password manager tool, because they've been hacked and had so many security breaches, there's not very much trust in their security practices anymore. Okay. Now, I'm saying that as someone who really liked LastPass, but as a cybersecurity professional, I can't fully endorse them anymore due to their reputation. So part of cybersecurity is protecting that. Another piece is compliance. Now, compliance is when the government or a regulatory standard is saying you have to do XYZ to protect your data. When you do XYZ to protect your data, that does two things. That bolsters your reputation because then you can tell your investors and your customers, hey, we are CCPA certified, or we are SOX certified, or we have SOC 2. If you don't know what those are, it's completely okay. I work in compliance, so I can explain those, but in essence, they're a stamp of approval from either a government or regulatory institution that says this company has taken all the appropriate steps to protect themselves and protect their data. That's good because it helps with your reputation as well as it helps protect your assets. A key thing about compliance here. Compliance is one of the only things that exists in cybersecurity that proactively protects your data in a way that lowers the likelihood and impact if you were to get hacked. There's a common saying in cybersecurity, it's not if you get hacked, it's when. So if you adhere to a compliance standard or a regulatory requirement, you are proactively saying you have put the controls and safeguards in place at multiple levels in your organization to protect yourself from an incident. It's not to say that incident won't happen, but if an incident did happen, well, then you have the safeguards in place to make it so that that incident doesn't balloon into something a lot more. This is what I mean by lowering the likelihood and the impact. So that's why compliance is really important. Then you have business continuity. In essence, this is saying if you have a service such as Salesforce.com, which you're going to learn about down the line, if your customers are unable to access Salesforce.com, they can't do their work. Therefore, you're losing money and you're losing reputation. Business continuity is centered around making sure that your service still is available. Personal responsibility. This is just making sure you understand and train your employees to know that cybersecurity is not just the responsibility of the cybersecurity team and the IT team. We like to say that employees are the very first line of defense when it comes to cybersecurity. It is everyone's responsibility to do things the right way and to process information securely. This is why cybersecurity awareness is really important, and this is why HR and legal are really important to cybersecurity. Most really good companies are going to build their culture off of cybersecurity. What that means is they build a culture of security. They build it in. There's often a value associated with security. For example, there is there are companies out there that have a company value, something along the lines of we do things the right way, or we focus on doing things right. They're trying to say we have integrity with how we process and store data. This is a part of making sure you have personal responsibility. And then there's the concept of adapting to threats. With cybersecurity, there are always new threats coming with a bunch of new tech that comes out, such as AI. There are always new ways that people are using AI to attack and do like different social engineering attacks. An example of one is deepfakes. So a deepfake is where a computer or an AI can make a video just like me talking to you right now, make it sound like me, make it look like me, make it have some of my own mannerisms, but it's not me. It's someone telling the computer to do XYZ. Okay. Now, the good thing is that we're not at the point where it's not obvious that it's AI yet. It lacks that human touch, that human element, but it's just an example of the changing and evolving threats that happen in cybersecurity. Collaboration and team efforts, like I said, this is not just an IT or cybersecurity thing. Everyone is responsible to be more secure. It requires collaboration from multiple teams. Yes, you have IT. Yes, you have the cybersecurity team. You also have the legal team. You also have the human resources team. You also have C-suite executives that have to buy in to the reason why we're doing XYZ. So it requires a lot of coordination. Now, it also requires a lot of communication. Yes, you have to be technical, but something that a lot of people tend to forget is you also need to be able to communicate why it's important. So this is where soft skills come in. Yes, you have to have the technical chops, but you have to be able to explain why it's important for the C-suite to put in safeguards. That's why it's important to add certain things the security system framework or the different layers in order to protect data. And then ethical considerations. In short, as a cybersecurity professional, you have to know what's right and wrong, and you have to do what's right. A very simple example, you should not have the same password for multiple websites. Okay. If you have one, if you're doing that right now and you've been waiting for a sign to change it, consider this your sign. Because if you have the same password for multiple websites, especially on your work computer, well, then that's not being secure. That means that you're putting yourself and your organization at risk. This is why you need to be very ethical, not just in that, but also how you're handling data. That means if you work at a hospital, you should not be emailing yourself on your personal email your patient files. That's a breach of what we call HIPAA. So there's something called personally identifiable information. That stands for PII. This is something that you will need to memorize and know. That's something such as your first name, last name, your email address, maybe your address, like your home address, anything, and your phone number, anything that can tie that information to you as a person. So that means if I'm a hacker and I find your personal information, I can use that information to blackmail you, to send you a certain email, to essentially like potentially ruin your life. So ethically, as a cybersecurity professional, you're going to be handling very sensitive information. So you have to process and use it very, very securely. You cannot be using it unethically. Okay? Let me check the chat here because I rambled on for a bit. Is there a password manager tool that I recommend? I do. A lot of government entities are using what we call Keeper now. So Keeper is a relatively new, it's a relatively new password manager tool, but through the government entities that I've seen as of late, a lot of them are using these. It's the same thing, does the same thing. It gives you different passwords to all your websites so you don't know any, that kind of stuff. Let's see. Looks like someone said, uh-oh. It is Mac compatible. So Keeper is not something that you hold locally. It can be a browser edition. So you can add an extension to your browser and it works just fine. Um, let's see here. Yep, Brandon, you're right. You should not write your passwords. So there is a movie, Ready Player One. And in this movie, right, the bad guy is this bad tech guy, right? And in the end, he writes his password on a post-it note and puts it right next to his computer. Well, that's what caused the good guys to win. So that's a very classic example of you should not have write your passwords down, okay? At all. That's why I suggest using a password manager tool. Is it worth to self-learn in parallel with the course CompTIA, Sec Plus, and CCNA? Andre, I see your question. Oybek and Zainab, I'll let you all tackle that one. I have my own thoughts on it, but I'll let them go ahead and give you that information. You can also DM them to talk a bit more about that. All right, let's go ahead and carry on here for the next 5 minutes. So this one, I think this will be the last one we tackle before we essentially go into take a break. So we have cybersecurity, information security, and physical security. So before I actually go into all of this, I want to point out something very specific. Now, when it comes to the concept of cybersecurity, there is this diagram that I like to use. So here, let me make it full screen. So here, this is where we have all the different cybersecurity departments, right? Something to know about cybersecurity is actually a subset of what we call information security. Information security is a very broad topic. Information security involves cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is like a subset of that. Sometimes you'll see information security, they'll have different departments. So you have cybersecurity. Within information security, you have something called data security or data privacy, which goes under the privacy umbrella. Then you have something called GRC. This is what I do now. GRC stands for governance, risk, and compliance. In essence, you remember what we said about regulatory standards, right? Well, GRC is centered around making sure that we're adhering to compliance, the different compliance standards that exist, and it involves the concept of risk management. Information security is all of this. Information security and cybersecurity are used synonymously. Sometimes people will call cybersecurity information security and vice versa. But in essence, it is under information security. Now, the reason why I say that is because cybersecurity is its own entity because it involves a bunch of different elements. As you can see here, cybersecurity, it involves red teaming, it involves blue teaming, which includes security operations, it includes security awareness and security engineers, identity access management. There are a lot that goes into cybersecurity. And don't worry, you'll learn what all these mean down the line. But what's different from that and information security is it involves everything. Now, there's also something here mentioned called physical security. Now, physical security is literally a security guard. Physical security is protecting the building. This might surprise you when we say, hey, cybersecurity can involve physical security. There is something called crisis management. Crisis management and physical security is essentially protecting against physical things that can happen, whether it's an earthquake, whether it is a fire, whether it's an active shooter, whether it's electricity going out or AC going out. All of these are physical things that have cybersecurity and information security consequences and repercussions. That is why we have deterrence. A physical security guard is considered a physical security deterrent. If a threat actor or a bad guy sees a security guard, they're like, oh, maybe I don't want to do this. Same thing with lights. If they see lights on a building, they'll say, oh, it looks like they're being very observant. Same thing with different cameras. If there are cameras, they'll say, hey, that's a physical security that I need to keep track of. An example is when I worked as a social engineer, one of the first things I did when I walked into a building was I looked to see how many cameras there were, what kind of cameras there were, whether they were unidirectional or multi-directional. It's literally like Mission Impossible. I did that so that I knew where are the areas that I could be clocked. If you're interested in those stories, don't worry, we'll get into them. Okay? Now, to kind of like speed run this, right? When it comes to cybersecurity, this is mainly around like digital systems and networks. This is just broader, and this is physical, things that you can actually touch. When I talk about things you can actually touch, an example of physical security is literally putting something in a locked file cabinet. This is actually a cybersecurity standard. And in one of the standards out there, the regulatory standards, they say, how are you protecting data and information? Like the same way a therapist has to lock their patient files away so that no one else can see them. Same thing with HR professionals. They cannot have physical things laying on their desks. They have to literally protect it physically like that. And then this is real world threats, physical security. This is digital information. Cybersecurity is trying to protect against malware, hacking, and breaches. And there's a human element of it. So you want to educate users overall. And then you have to make sure there's proper access control, which is why you have physical security guards. A piece of physical security is also access badges. So a lot of good companies that have good practice mean that a lot of companies have to have access cards in order to access a certain building. That's called access control. And then also implementing different policies and protecting the servers, that kind of stuff. All right, let's take a quick pause there. I'm going ahead and going to stop sharing my screen.
So thank you. I hope you had a quick break, a nice break, and now the floor is back yours, Andrew. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. All right, I did want to address something. I think I saw some people were asking about certifications, and they're saying, should I do Sec Plus? Should I do CCNA? Essentially, what people are saying are accurate. There is one thing I do want to mention. Someone was saying that a lot of certifications are requiring Sec Plus. That is very important. We will talk about this here. However, I also wanted to add something else. So I know that a lot of people in this class have never been in cybersecurity before, or it's not something that they're used to. And so there are some that we call entry-level certifications. So one of those entry-level certifications that you can do, there are two of them that I'll present. So the first one is one that's pretty common. It's presented by ICS Squared. It's certified in cybersecurity. It is a completely free exam with free training. If you do pass, well, then you might have to pay like $50 for the actual certification credentials, but it's good because ICS Squared is also the institution that does the CISSP. The CISSP is essentially the gold standard for cybersecurity certifications. It is a certified information security specialist professional, I believe. Yep. So information system security professional. So this is the gold standard. Now you do need several years experience to do that. However, something to get familiar is certified in cybersecurity. Now, this is not as difficult as an exam as it appears. I promise you that if you complete this course and if you pay attention, if you do a little bit of the training and watch some YouTube videos, you will pass. Here's the benefit though. There's an even easier exam that you can do. It's a very easy certification. It's called the Cybersecurity Awareness Professional Certification. First thing to note is that this is not a recognized certification. It's not something that is I would say like people say, "Oh, you have this? Wow, that's awesome. That means that you're a cybersecurity awareness professional." This is essentially a cybersecurity 101 certification. And I'll put both of these inside of the chat so you all can have them. But the reason why I put these here is because if you're wanting to get into cybersecurity, it's better sooner rather than later to try to get the word cybersecurity on your LinkedIn and on your resume. That way you start popping up on some recruiter's radar. Now, sure, it is true. You are going to need at least the Sec Plus in order to be seriously considered for roles. But these are some certifications that you can take a look at. I guarantee you that for this one, you could probably take this during this course and complete it within a half hour. Completely easy, really, really simple. If I think like Andrea, you have some IT experience, this should be a breeze. Okay. This is not a proctored exam. You have the ability to essentially take this on your own. I've had first-time cybersecurity students take them and they just made the logical answer. So keep these in mind. These are two really good certifications for you to take a look at. Okay, let's continue on with class. Now, this is definitely something that you are going to have to memorize, and that is the CIA Triad. Now, the CIA is often confused with the CIA as in like the CIA agency. Now, this is not that. Anytime you see the CIA Triad, the first thing I want you to think of are three words: confidentiality, integrity, availability. Confidentiality, integrity, availability. These are the three words that you're going to have to memorize as the definition of the CIA triad. This is really important because, like I said before, this is the cornerstone of cybersecurity. So, what do these three principles mean? Now you'll realize that every aspect of cybersecurity touches on one, if not multiple of these. Okay. So the first one is confidentiality. Confidentiality is focused on only the right people can access the information. That means that people who should not be accessing the information should not be seeing it. They should have zero access to it. This is the concept of confidentiality. Okay. Now, this is important because it's essentially saying that the information that you have in your system should only be accessible to those you give access to. An example, a salesperson should not have admin access to all of everyone's salaries in HR. That should not be something that they have access to. A salesperson only needs access to sales information. They don't need access to anything else. We'll talk about the concept of least privilege later on. This is confidentiality, not just like from external people, but internally as well. The other one is integrity. Integrity is involved making sure that information is accurate and it hasn't been tampered with. That's all that means. That means that if you have certain files or information within your system or your network, you know without a shadow of a doubt that it hasn't been tampered with. Someone had mentioned the concept of non-repudiation, right? So non-repudiation is saying you cannot say you did not do XYZ. This is what logging and monitoring is for. It's essentially to say, hey, our systems have high integrity. No one has actually tampered with them. And the last one is about availability. You remember when I talked about DDoS attacks, right? So DDoS stands for Distributed Denial of Service. Distributed denial of service is aimed at affecting the availability of a system. That means that the availability means that your system is always available. That means if you go to google.com, it's still available. If you go to gmail.com, you can access your emails. The opposite of availability is if you go to any of the websites you go to often, maybe it's Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and they don't work. Believe it or not, this has happened to all of those websites at one point in time. For one reason or another, they're not available. Now, as you can imagine, because these are powerful systems that are being used all the time and because they're revenue generating, they need to be up and running 24/7. That's why availability is so important because every system has to be available at all times. If your system fails, you need to have what we call a failover. Okay. So CIA stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You are going to be quizzed on this at the end of class, so keep that in mind. When I look at the CIA triad, right? I like to think of it as a triangle. Information security and cybersecurity is focused on these three pillars, okay? When we're talking about confidentiality, that's access management, making sure we know who has access to what, if they're allowed, that kind of stuff. We'll talk about AAA in the next slide here. And then there's integrity. Integrity is centered around making sure that documents haven't been changed, file hasn't been changed, code hasn't been changed. That's what that's centered around. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Mission Impossible, it's actually interesting that Mission Impossible focuses so much on this. They try to lock in, they try to access things that they don't have access to, and they try to change data so that it actually favors them. A common example is when Tom Cruise has a certain flash drive and he plugs it into a computer, and then that flash drive essentially changes all of the data inside the computer to let Benji, one of his guys on his team, walk into a facility. That's an example of changing the integrity of a system. Believe it or not, those things do happen. They are real things. And then availability is, again, making sure that your website or your software or system is available. All right, so that's the CIA triad. So I think we're gonna skip this for now just for time's sake, but I think you all pretty much understand the fundamental need of the CIA triad. I'll ask you later on in your own words why that's important. Again, cornerstone of cybersecurity, and you are going to need to know it for the Sec Plus. Okay, so understanding the different principles and what exactly they mean, how they break down, how we're going to reference them throughout the remainder of this course is important. Each element is going to be referenced for the CIA triad. So, quiz thread. Which of the following is a fundamental principle of security that ensures that data is not disclosed to unauthorized users or systems? Data is not disclosed to unauthorized user or systems. Thank you so much, everyone who's answering in the thread. Let's keep that up. You all are doing a great job. All right, looks like we have a unanimous answer. It is C, confidentiality. That is correct. Confidentiality is centered around making sure that only the appropriate people know certain information or have access to certain things. So, good job, everyone. Next one. Quiz question 2. Again, let's make sure to comment on the thread. Which component of the CIA triad ensures that data is accessible and usable by authorized users? Keyword here, accessible and usable. Accessible and usable. All right, everyone is saying C again. That is correct. That is the concept of availability. So availability is a concept of making sure that a system or software is accessible and usable at all times. The authorized users piece is also a key element because it ties in with confidentiality, but the key element here is availability. Good job, everyone. Great job. All right, you all are doing so well with commenting on that thread. Let's keep that up. All right, so we talked about confidentiality, right? In confidentiality, there is something called the AAA model, also known as the AAA model. Now, the AAA model, in very simple terms, is a concept associated with confidentiality. We're trying to understand three things. AAA stands for authentication, authorization, and accounting/auditing. So the AAA model is something that you do also want to memorize. It stands for authentication, authorization, and accounting. This is an element of confidentiality. In essence, authentication is essentially asking, hey, proving you are who you say you are. It's essentially proving your identity. So an example of authentication is something like a password or a fingerprint. This is the concept of this is also an industry. You can go into this in cybersecurity. So there's something called the IAM industry. IAM stands for Identity and Access Management. If you want to be a cybersecurity professional and you want to specialize in something, you can specialize in IAM. It is something that is widely becoming a big, big need. Now, what essentially it is it's centered around making sure you're doing the AA process. You are authenticating who you are. Authentication is saying, are you who you say you are? How do you authenticate that? You can authenticate that with something as a password or maybe even a fingerprint. Or if you have like an iPhone or a phone that requires you to identify who you are so you can access your phone, it also can be your face scan. This is called a biometric. We'll talk about that later on in class. But authentication is proving who you are. A simple example is if you go to a librarian and you say, hey, my name is Helen. Okay. And I'm a member at this library and I want to check out a book. You have to prove that you're Helen. You can prove it by multiple different ways by providing an ID. So with that in mind, answering this question in the thread, what are other places where you have to authenticate who you are in real life? So comment in that thread. Let me know some real world examples of places and where you have to authenticate who you are. Answers coming in. At a bank, 100%. Workplace, yes. There it is. That's what I was looking for. Marcial says at an airport, work computer. Airport again, says Craig. Harsh says a login portal. Bank, workplace, voting. Yep, that's a really good one. Thank you for commenting on the thread, everyone. This is great. Costco is a really good example because you have to show your card saying that you're a member. These are all good examples. So the one that I like to explain is at an airport, because at an airport, you have to present an ID such as a passport or an ID card, driver's license, something in order to prove who you are. Richard says a gym. That's also a really great example. These are all examples of authentication. We may just think of it as, of course, I'm going to present you with my ID, but it's an important step in cybersecurity. This keeps the concept of the C in confidentiality. The next one, authorization. So in authentication, you are identifying who you are. You're saying, I am this person. Well, next, after we say, okay, you're this person, great. Well, then we want to make sure you're authorized to access this. So you can authenticate who you are, but just because you authenticate who you are does not mean that you have automatic access. We need to know that you're authorized to be able to see or be allowed to access the premises to see this file or to edit XYZ. So the idea with authorization is that we have to have a location that says, hey, this person has access to these things. There are multiple different systems that exist that allow you to do that. We won't get into that right now, but authorization is just centered around making sure, hey, are you allowed to access XYZ? The very common example is the gym. Did you have something you wanted to ask, Ramsey?
Sorry, I accidentally pressed it. My bad.
Okay, no worries, no worries. So with authorization, if we know who you are, well, then we also need to know that you have access to XYZ. That's really, really important. After authorization, if let's say you are who you say who you are, and you have authorization to access the system, the next thing we want to do is something called accounting. That's the third A. Accounting is essentially tracking what you did and when. This is centered around the concept of non-repudiation. Non-repudiation just means that we as the company need to track what you do, when, and why, and we need to log it so that we can prove that you did XYZ. Why are we doing this? Well, one of the threats that exists in cybersecurity is something called an insider threat. An insider threat is when you have a legitimate employee who becomes disgruntled with the company for whatever reason, and they take actions against the company, whether that be destroying files, stealing data, selling information. An example of this is if an employee steals data and sells it to a competitor. Now, this may or may not have happened under when I was at a company where an employee downloaded all of the customer data and sold it to a competitor. And that may or may not have been something that me and my team were able to find and stop because we were accounting for this person's actions. We saw that they were logging into the systems, downloading information at a very odd hour, and they're trying to extrapolate or take out very large files. So, and when they were trying to send it within our network to addresses that we had flagged. So this is an example of accounting. Why do we do it? Well, we do it for multiple reasons. Not only are we doing it to account for what people are doing, but we need to keep track of all of this in case we get audited. If we get audited, what the auditor does, they say, hey, give me all the logs of the things that happened on this server, and I'm going to pick a random one. That's the thing. They're going to pick a random one. So we have to make sure that all of our accounting and our logs are really pristine. So that is the CIA Triad and the AAA model. Now, for the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and keep going, but my hope is that you understand the importance of the CIA Triad and the AAA model. To recap, the CIA Triad stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Are you who you say you are? And are you allowed to access certain information? Is the data that you're looking at not tampered with, and is it fully complete and accurate? And are your systems fully available for all authorized users? Confidentiality includes the topic of the AAA model. AAA model stands for authentication. Are you who you say you are? Authorization. Are you allowed to access the system or this folder? Accounting. What are you doing and when? So that we can keep track. That's what the CIA model and the AAA model stand for. Okay? If you ever wonder about the CIA model and the AAA model, which I would argue is one of the most important things in this entire lesson, I like to think of it this way. Think in your own words how you would explain the CIA Triad and the AAA model to, let's say, your child, or maybe your mom or your dad, someone who may not be as technical. Think of how you would explain it to them, because one of the best ways to learn is to teach. What I used to do when I was learning this is I would reach out to my mom, who's completely non-technical. I'd say, hey, mom, I want to explain to you a little thing that I learned in my cybersecurity class. It's a CIA model. It's like, oh, confidentiality is just logging into somewhere. Integrity is, hey, did you change any of these documents? And then accounting is, hey, looks like you changed these documents. This is the history, right? Try to think of it that way. This will help you remember it more. Okay, let's move on to the concept of security best practices. Now, this is something you are going to have to remember because you're becoming a cybersecurity professional. It's no longer just telling people what to do. You have to live it. You have to walk the walk. So these are some of the best cybersecurity practices. This is actually something you can tell your friends and family today. After this lesson, you are equipped to tell them, hey, these are the things you should do as a cybersecurity professional. My argument? You should do these things now yourself so that you're not telling people something that you're not doing yourself, okay? So the first one is called the concept of least privilege. The concept of least privilege is very simple. You should only have access to what you need access to. You should not need any more. What I mean by that is if you work in marketing, you need access to the marketing site, you need access to the website, you need access to marketing, branding, data, that kind of stuff. Now, should a marketing person need full admin access to configure a network? They should not. That's a concept of least privilege. Every person in a company should only have access to the things they need in order to do their job, nothing more. The opposite of that is if a salesperson had access to admin rights, configuration. They had access to logins. They could go into any customer account, change anything that they want. That is a huge amount of power that they don't need. A salesperson just needs salesperson information and data and what they access to, nothing more, nothing less. Okay? That's all it means. You only need access to what you need access to. Kind of like a need to know basis. This is really important in cybersecurity because it is a principle that should be enforced all the way around. There is something in cybersecurity called UAR that stands for User Access Review. That's where every quarter people have to review everyone who has access to a bunch of different websites or systems. The purpose of that is the concept of least privilege. If someone changes roles within the company, they no longer need access to their previous company's records for whatever reason because they change roles. With changing roles, you also need to change access. Strong authentication methods. In very simple terms, anytime you have a place where you need to log in, you need to have what we call MFA. MFA stands for multi-factor authentication. So multi-factor authentication means that you don't just have a username and password that gets you access to a system. Instead, you need to have a secondary form of proving you are who you say you are or you have access to it. This can be in the form of a text message that comes to your phone. It could be a notification that comes on your phone. It could be something called a one-time password. So one-time password is where you get emailed a specific code, and then that code is what you use to log in. The purpose of this is because nowadays it can become a lot easier to find passwords and crack them so that you're able to log in. So having MFA is important. Personally, I have MFA on everything. I particularly use something called this. So this you see here, it's called a YubiKey. And a YubiKey is a very special key that only I have access to. There is not another one in the world that exists. This is really important because this is what I use to log into my systems. If it says, hey, you're logging in from another country or you're logging in from another computer, we want to make sure it's you. Please plug in your YubiKey. Okay. The thing that's important with this is like, this is very unique to me. It's something I have and no one else can replicate it. Sure, I have my phone, I have my email, but this is like what I really like. I will put this in the chat so that you can have it. Now, this is a little bit overkill. I personally really like it because it's something I have. However, something to keep in mind is this means that you can never lose it. Because if you lose it, you lose access. Part of cybersecurity means leveling up keeping track of things are important. This is a key to so much, so I cannot lose this. This is why every day I know exactly where my keys are and where my phone is and where my wallet is at all times. So Harsh, that's a really good question. The benefit is I don't lose it. That is a piece you're going to have to keep in mind. I know where this is at all times. Do I have a backup mechanism? Yeah, I do. However, because this is so important and because literally my work is dependent on this, I won't lose it. A part of it is if something is really important to you, well, then you won't lose it. Same thing with your phone. It's really important. All right, let's carry on here because we have a couple one. Patching and software updates. This is really important because if there's a new update, that means that they're trying to probably fix a vulnerability that exists. Secure configurations. An example of this is when you install a new email, well then when you install a new email or a new Wi-Fi rather, it comes with a basic username and password. You want to change that. That's a very simple example of secure configuration and hardening. Secure coding practices. So I think Andre was mentioning this. He has a full stack certification. If you're new to coding, or if you don't know any idea of what coding is, in essence, developers create code or they create software, but when they create that code and software, they're making it with the intention to create a specific thing. It has to do a specific task. Well, secure coding practice means that yes, you want it to do that specific task, but you want to do it securely. An example is if you're transferring data within that software, well, then you have to make sure that that data is encrypted. Or if you're storing data somewhere within that software, it's connected to something, that has to be very secure. It has to be encrypted. This is what we call secure coding practices. That is security by design, is another way to call it. Data classification, it means understanding what data you're handling and classifying it accordingly. This is what I meant when I said you need to understand what data you have in your system because you're going to need to know how to protect that data. It's typically classified in terms of criticality, severity, and sensitivity. Because if you're storing something like we call something like credit card information, something that's called PCI, that's payment card information. So if you're storing payment card information, you cannot be storing that in plain text. You have to store it encrypted and you have to process that data very, very specifically. There are laws, regulations that require you to do it that way. That's why data classification is important. And that's why when we talk about these classifications later on or compliance, this will come up. Incident response planning, that means that you need to have what we call an incident response plan or an incident response playbook. The worst thing that can happen when an incident happens is people panic. They say, oh no, we're getting hacked. What do we do? Who do we reach out to? What are the steps we take? This combats exactly that. An incident response playbook essentially says, all right, if an incident happens, these are the steps you take. This is what you do. This is who you reach out to. These are the people that you get in contact with. XYZ. These are all part of incident response planning. Network segmentation is a really important one. If you're not familiar with networking, I'll just break it down. So in networking, you have different departments, right? You have sales, marketing, IT, C-suite, that kind of stuff. Network segmentation means that each department has their own lane, their own technological lane. When they have their own technological lane, well then if, let's say, a salesperson gets hacked, well then they're only going to impact the sales computers. They won't impact marketing, they won't impact HR, it only impacts sales. The idea with network segmentation is that you're protecting all the other departments from themselves. This lowers the likelihood and the impact of a hack. That's all network segmentation is. And then you have security awareness training. This is basically what you all are doing here. So it's where we're training you on cybersecurity, except this one is very employee specific. We're training employees on how best to be secure at the organization level. What I mean by the organization level is we're training them on the best practices for that specific company. If your company has a very specific way that you need to be that you have to share data with external resources, this is where that training would happen. You should not, at the very least, if you're sharing files via email, you should at least password protect the files in case either your company or the external company's email gets hacked. Well, then they need a password to access the actual file. And then regular security assessments. So regular security assessments is just saying, hey, we're going to do a mini audit or an assessment of your security best practices. That means they're going to maybe audit your processes and procedures, your policies, if MFA is in place, whether you're rotating passwords every 90 days or so. Those are the type of assessments that are being done. Let me look at some of the chat here. Okay. Yeah, I see some people answer that. As a cybersecurity guy, do you have a backup in case you get hacked? I have about 3 backups. One of them is air gapped. As in a company you work at. Yep. So this is called it's called multiple things. So when we're talking about backups, we're talking about business continuity, which we'll talk about in today's course, as well as disaster recovery. Both of these require backups on backups on backups. So there's something in networking called RAID 1, 2, and 3. So you can look this up if you want, but RAID, it's a lot more technical, but RAID stands for redundant array of independent disks. It's essentially a backup, a massive, massive backup. And there are different types of RAID levels that you can do. There's RAID 0, RAID 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. These are all different backup ways that you can bring your system back. Now, to Marcial's question for me about if I have backups, I personally have like 3 backups. One of them is local, another one is on an SSD, like a hard drive, and another one is air gap, meaning that it's backed up, but it's stored somewhere where only I have access to it. But you have to keep in mind that I try to practice what I preach. So I have a ton of backups and I do pay for it because I do think it's important and I have very important files I want to keep. Let's see some other questions. Yep. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and answer this question here. Quiz thread. So the question is, which security best practice does the scenario of parents creating separate accounts for their kids with limited access exemplify? Which best practice? A, B, C, or D? I love it. You all are answering in the thread. Good job, everyone. That is awesome. Good job, good job. Which best practice does that exemplify? We have a unanimous consensus. Everyone is saying A, that is accurate. It is the concept of least privilege. So what the parents are doing here is they're creating separate account for the kids and those separate accounts means they only need access to that specific account, nothing else. Next question. Quiz thread B. So the question is, which security best practice involves dividing office networks into smaller segments, such as separating finance from human resources to prevent a vulnerability from hopping from one to the other? Again, we have a consensus. It's C, network segmentation. Well done, everyone. Network segmentation is just the dividing of departments. Great job. All right. Great job, everyone. Thank you for commenting in the thread. So next, let's talk a little bit about what we call gap analysis. So what is a gap analysis? In essence, a gap analysis is essentially looking at current state versus ideal state. Ideal state is where, okay, these are all the security measures that we need to have in place. This is where we currently are. We need to find the gap and how to bridge the gap, okay? It's essentially reviewing and comparing current security practices with either ideal state or, more often than not, an industry standard. So a gap analysis is where you sit down, you look at everything that exists in your current system versus where you want it to be. Okay, so that's what a gap analysis is. How do you perform a gap analysis? Well, the first thing is you need to decide on your ideal state. You want to decide, okay, where do we want to be? Okay. And then that involves doing identifying vulnerabilities. You want to identify vulnerabilities, weaknesses. You want to identify places where you could improve. Okay. When you do that, well, then you go into planning. You need to say, okay, if these are all the vulnerabilities that we have, we have to come up with a plan on how to remediate them or how to at least find out. We need to find a way to fix them. This typically involves a step called prioritization. When you are able to come up with all the gaps, well, then you as a team need to prioritize the items that are going to be the most impactful and the most severe. So this is typically prioritized based off of both of those. Now, when you do that planning, you identify them, you plan out which ones you want to actually remediate first, and then you need to go into maintenance. So with maintenance, that means you've identified them, you fixed the gap, now you need to maintain the gaps. A gap analysis is not a one-time exercise. It is something that should be done often. Now, more often than not, after you do a gap analysis, typically you'll move into an assessment, for future stages. An example, If I go into an organization and they're trying to be ISO certified, right? Or they're trying to adhere to NIST standards. You don't have to know what those are yet. I'll explain them later. They're just standards. So those standards have a list of requirements that they have to abide by. Well, then I'll go in and say, okay, these are the ones that you have. Great. These are the gaps that you have. This is the ideal state. Let's make a plan. These are the items we're going to focus on. Let's fix them. We fix them. Then we say, okay, great. We fixed them. It's not like we never look at them again. We revisit them and make sure we have a plan to maintain them moving forward. Ideally, there'll be like a 2.0 where we try to make it even better. Okay. So that's what a gap analysis is. So let me show you an example of a gap analysis. So here is a gap analysis template. Now, this is a basic gap analysis. Notice that you have the first area, which is the domain. Typically, there'll be different domains that you want to adhere by, whether that's security awareness, access, or incident response, access management, all this stuff. Then you have the current state saying, okay, only about 30% of employees have gone through training or incident response. Our response time is in 2 hours, right? The target is that we want 90 employees to be aware of, let's say, phishing emails, and then we want to get down to 1 hour response. Here's the gap description. There are 40 employees untrained. There's a slow response time, that kind of stuff. Typically, there will be a section that says impact. So I'll put this in the chat so you all can review it on your own. And so typically an impact, it'll say, hey, this is what's important. Now, something to note, when we're talking about impact, impact is typically something that you want to bring to senior leadership. This is where they want to know what is the impact if we look at this, okay? And then there'll be a priority level. Now, this is just a technical gap analysis. There is something called CMMC. It's a standardization for compliance. It's kind of different, but it follows the same type of structure. Typically, there's something called an identifier. Each control has a very specific identifier so that you can keep track of which control you're talking about. And you can review this on your own, but they typically have a unique identifier and they do the same exact thing. The priority level is how you're able to measure which ones come first, okay? Now, there's a bunch of information on the far side, including like who the specific owner is. More often than not, you'll have a specific name, and oftentimes you'll have a secondary owner in case this person is out for whatever reason, and then you have the status. The status in this case kind of functions as like a project management tool where you're showing which of these controls is in progress, which one has started, which one is complete. So this is an example of a gap analysis template. They're all going to look a little different depending on what companies you work at, but it's just a very simple example. All right. Now, let's talk about industry standards. Now, this is where GRC comes in. As a reminder, and let me go back to Perplexity here. If you're not using Perplexity or other AI tools, highly suggest you do so. So an example is, let me just say, define GRC and cybersecurity in simple terms, bullet pointed. I like Perplexity a lot because it is able to spit out very specific information. Now here it says GRC stands for governance, risk, and compliance. I'm going to say, make it even simpler in 3 bullet points and easy for anyone to understand. So it takes it and makes it very simple. So it says in 3 bullet points, it says GRC stands for governance, risk, and compliance. Governance, it's about setting rules and how to keep data safe. Risk involves identifying potential threats and taking steps to prevent them. Compliance is ensuring that we are staying within regulation and legal issues. So GRC is what industry standards and frameworks is associated with. In this case, frameworks is defined as a set of rules or guidelines that you want to work off of. Now, More often than not, these framework and guidelines, they don't necessarily have like a certification, like a ticker saying, okay, you are certified in this specific thing. I like to think of them as best practices. NIST is an example. Now, there is one called ISO 27001. This is a specific one. Note, you can get certified in ISO and NIST. That is something that you can do if you're interested. Any cybersecurity professional can do that, and that'll bolster their resume. ISO stands for Information Security Management System, or that's the governing body. But ISO 27001 is essentially centered around making sure that you can implement, maintain, and continually improve information security best practices. It's really, really focused on managing information security. All right, that's all it's trying to do. It's centered around managing information security. Something to remember when it comes to ISO, let me sure I bring it up, is that it provides a guidance and it is a best practice on risk management and cybersecurity best practices. Keep that in mind. ISO 27001 is centered around risk management and cybersecurity best practices. In essence, it's from the International Organization of Standardizations, and it's intended to provide a set of rules so that you can make sure to comply and have just cybersecurity best practices. This is a lot, so I'll just summarize it by saying it provides you a guide for, again, risk management and cybersecurity best practices. The other one is NIST. This is something you will have to know. So NIST stands for National Institute of Standards and Technology. You can, as an individual, you can become NIST certified, but as an organization, there's not like a certification process for NIST. Instead, it is a framework that you tend to follow in order to comply with, I would call it government level cybersecurity best practices. So NIST is a US government created framework. It was essentially done to kind of like maintain standards of different type of industries. So it is not just cybersecurity related, but it's all industries and technology related. So NIST is a really important one. Now, the CSF is very specific. It stands for the cybersecurity framework. There is a NIST standard, so NIST 501, that's very specific, but the NIST CSF is centered around cybersecurity framework. It is meant to identify and give you different categories on how to address cybersecurity overall. Now, there are 5 very basic steps to NIST, and I would suggest it's not you. I wouldn't say memorize this, but at least know it, okay? You would want to at least know it. If you really want to go the extra mile, I would say you do want to memorize it because NIST is something that you're going to run into in your cybersecurity career. The 5 levels are identify. So you want to make sure that you can identify all the systems, the data, devices, software that you're using so that you know what you're trying to do, what you're trying to protect, because protect is the second step. You want to have a system and process in place to protect all the things that you've identified. And then you want to be able to detect. So detect is making sure that you're identifying any vulnerabilities, malicious code, maybe some intrusions that are trying to happen. These are all steps that are important for just a basic cybersecurity infrastructure. The next one is to respond. This just means you need to have an incident response plan. You need to have steps in place to respond to a security incident so you know what to do when that happens and who to reach out to. And the final step is you need to make sure you have a way to recover. The recovery is typically revolved around things such as business continuity plan or a data loss prevention plan. I won't spend too much time on this because we do have a couple more slides we need to get to. Um, I'm going to also skip this slide because we want to get through to more. I would say the thing to just remember is ISO and NIST are 2 frameworks that you want to be aware of. You will hear these later on in cybersecurity. So I would say just know that they are guidelines and frameworks for best practices in cybersecurity. NIST CSF is very specific to cybersecurity, but both of these are guidelines to cybersecurity best practices. All right, there is this principle in cybersecurity called zero trust. Well, what is zero trust? It is a cybersecurity framework centered around this phrase. It is centered around the phrase of never trust, always verify. That is the concept of zero trust. That means that you don't trust anyone or any systems in your network. You always verify. Okay. An easy way to kind of like think of this is if you're at your organization, everyone has a badge, right? So when you're entering your work building and you badge in and someone tries to walk in behind you, you turn around to them and you say, "Hey, can I see your badge?" That's never trust, always verify, especially if it's not someone you know, because everyone who's going into your building should be verified. This is a good, real cybersecurity practice. That is something you can do today, is you don't let people just walk in behind you. They have to badge in. Yes, it's annoying. Yes, it's uncomfortable. And yes, it could be considered strange. However, it's always better to be safe than sorry. You always need to never trust, always verify. So this is the principle, and what I just explained is a social slash physical component of it. But from a technical standpoint, it's the same thing. You always have to verify on the technical level. So what does that mean? That means that you need to verify identity. You need to authenticate anyone who's trying to access a device, anyone who's trying to log in somewhere, anyone who's operating within your network. The way you do that is you make sure that there's strong multi-factor authentication involved, and you're making sure to do really good authorization verification and authenticating verification. This is a lot more technical that I would want to get to in this specific class, but you will get into that later on. There's also the concept of least privilege. Least privilege is associated with the zero trust framework because you only want to give people access to what they need access to in order to do their job. They don't need any more, okay? That's a piece of zero trust because in essence, you don't trust someone to have more access than they need. That's why you only give them access to what they need access to. Then there's the concept of micro-segmentation. So I mentioned network segmentation, right? Each department has their own lane that they operate on. Well, in those lanes, you can also micro-segment them into even more lanes. For example, in the sales department, you can put a specific lane for SDRs. Those are sales development reps. They're the people who call, say, "Hey, you should buy our software." You put them in a specific lane. And then you put account executives in a specific lane. You put directors in a specific lane. That way, if a SDR, a sales development rep, gets hacked, well, then the director won't get hacked because the director is access to more things. That's what micro-segmentation means. It's like putting them in different, very specific lanes in order to reduce the exposure of a specific hack. Continuous monitoring, that just means monitoring where people are at. Device health verification. This is just making sure that the devices on your network are up to date and that they don't have vulnerabilities. Encryption everywhere. That means encrypting everything. And then dynamic access policies. That just means that you're dynamically allowing and disallowing access in real time. This is actually changing a lot with the introduction of AI. So that you'll learn a bit more down the line. But in essence, zero trust means never trust, always verify. That's what I want you to remember for zero trust. All right. So this is an example of no zero trust. That means, hey, there are threats. We have one firewall. Everyone trusts everyone within here. Okay, that means, hey, I'm a computer. I can access everything. Well, if I'm a threat actor and I infect one of these computers, all these computers are infected. Okay, that's all that means. Now, if we go into the zero trust model, notice that each of these computers have their own little box. So if I am able to infect one computer, that's the only computer that gets infected. None of the other ones get infected. That's what I mean by zero trust and the concept of least privilege. This one person only has access to this. They don't have access to anything else. Whereas here, they have access to all these computers. So in essence, zero trust means that one person is infected, means that it spreads everywhere. With zero trust, that only one computer gets infected. That's all it means. Benefits. You're more secure. You reduce the attack surface. This is what that means. This is a very big attack surface. You reduce it by just having that one computer become impacted. Improved incident response. Well, with this, you have a lot more monitoring, what you don't see here. Here, yes, you have overarching monitoring, which means that, hey, I'm watching everything. Here, every single one of these computers has what we call, well, we won't get into that, but all of these have a lot more monitoring, which means that we can respond to it faster. And then it's more adaptable, and zero trust is typically a framework that's associated with a bunch of different compliance standards. Let's move on. I'm going to make this homework. So your homework for today, just because I really wanted to focus on some important stuff, is to make sure to look up the Stuxnet worm attack. Now, I would even say this, look it up on Perplexity. Look up what Stuxnet is on Perplexity and learn about it more, just because I want to leave some time for other stuff. Perfect. Okay, great. We will skip that as well because you can look at that later. All right. Now, let's go ahead and do some knowledge checks. So here is, we're just going to do everything on this quiz thread, okay? So quiz thread, question number 1. What are the 3 primary principles of the CIA Triad? A, B, C, or D? Thank you for commenting on the thread, everyone. Everyone is saying B. And just so you know, we're going to keep commenting on this thread for all these quizzes, okay? So everyone is saying B. That is correct. The CIA Triad is centered around confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality is centered around, are you who you say you are? Do you have access to this information? That's what it's centered around. It has the CIA Triad as well as the AAA model. As we remember, AA stands for authorization, authentication, and accounting. And then we have integrity. So integrity stands for, has anything been changed or altered? Is this accurate? Nothing has changed. And availability is that your systems are still up and running. Great job, everyone. So glad that made sense. The next one is cybersecurity frameworks. So this is one of the things I had mentioned. Which cybersecurity framework focuses on providing guidance for risk management and cybersecurity best practices? See a lot of questions comes in here. It looks like some of you took notes. Great job. Thank you for still commenting on the thread. As a reminder, we're still commenting on the thread, everyone. All right, and everyone's saying B. That is correct. So the ISO 27001, that is the cybersecurity framework that's focused on risk management and cybersecurity best practices. Good job. Still commenting on the thread. All right, last question. We'll do a new thread for this one, just because I think it'll help some people. Zero trust model quiz question. That's the new thread that we're commenting on. So the question is, what is the core principle of the zero trust security model? A, B, C, or D? Love seeing everyone commenting on the thread. Okay. All right. Everyone is saying B. That is accurate. So notice how B is saying verify and authenticate all network traffic regardless of location, whereas the other 3 is saying, hey, trust all users, trust all credentials, allow unrestricted access. That is a different from zero trust. With zero trust, it comes along the lines of never trust, always verify. That's zero trust. Very simple way to remember it. And then in that same thread here, or actually I'll just post another one, security essentials. Security Essentials quiz question. Which security measure is designed to protect against unauthorized access to data by restricted user privileges? Love it. Everyone's commenting on the thread. This is great. Great job, everyone. A, B, C, or D? Okay, looks like we're kind of split here. All right, I'm seeing a lot of A. So if some of you put C, that's because you probably have some tech experience. So C would technically be correct as well. But the overarching answer here is A, which is just the concept of least privilege. So for those of you who don't know, role-based access control, which is called RBAC, if you picked C, you're also correct. It is a form of least privilege. Least privilege is overarching, saying you only need access to what you need access to. And then RBAC is even more stringent. It's what I was talking about when I say an SDR only needs to have access to SDR work. An account executive needs to only have access to account executive devices and systems, okay? So both of these are correct. Good job, everyone. And then last question, security essentials. That's the thread for that. What is the purpose of MFA? What is the purpose for MFA? All right, everyone says B. Good job, everyone. That is correct. So, as a reminder, MFA stands for multi-factor authentication. That means that you don't just have a username and password anymore. You need to either have verification via email, phone, one-time password, or like I said before, YubiKey, right? These are all forms of MFA. Let me see here. Okay. Great job, everyone. Let me double check the chat here. Okay. All right. So that was everything that I wanted to go through. If you're going to remember anything, right? If I were to highlight some of the things in this course, the most important things that are going to impact you as a cybersecurity professional is just to remember this, that the cornerstone of cybersecurity is the CIA Triad. It's centered around confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality encompasses the AAA model, which stands for authentication. Are you who you say you are? Authorization. Are you allowed to access this system or platform? And accounting. We are tracking what you're doing and when, so that if we get audited or if there's an insider threat, we'll know why. We also went through cybersecurity best practices, which you can start using today. MFA is a good one. Least privilege is a good one. Using strong passwords. You can also review that. We talked about gap analysis. I gave you all that template. We talked about industry frameworks and how these are just a guideline for cybersecurity best practices. And then we talked about zero trust. And answer here, what is the saying around zero trust? And please, in the thread, let me know what the saying around zero trust is. It's just 4 words. Looking for replies there. There you go. Love to see it. That's one thing you'll remember forever. Never trust, always verify. That's the concept with zero trust.